Good day to everyone, and thank you for joining us for this virtual session of the Science Summit at the UN General Assembly. It's my pleasure to moderate this session on achieving health for all and meeting sustainable development goals. On the behalf of DNDi, MMV, and the TB Alliance, I'd like to welcome you to this session and looking forward to an exciting discussion. My name is Bahumati Tanji. I am an infectious diseases doctor and a physician scientist and an assistant professor of medicine at Emory University in Atlanta. And I will be moderating the discussions over the next hour and a half. Over the last 3 years, we have lived through a global pandemic of COVID-19. And during that time, we have seen tremendous innovation, both in therapeutics and vaccine development. And I think that all the experiences of the past 3 years have really brought into sharp focus the critical importance of investing in biomedical research and development to achieve health for all. Unfortunately, despite the tremendous advances that have happened in vaccines and therapeutics developments, we have also seen serious gaps in equitable access to health tools and technologies and services. Health for all is a driver for sustainable development and cannot be attained without scaling up investments in both biomedical innovation and equitable access. This session will focus on poverty-related and neglected tropical diseases. In the first panel, our speakers will discuss how good practices in innovation, such as access principles built into the research and development process, are contributing to achieving good health and well-being, which is the third sustainable development goal. In the second panel, our speakers will explore the solutions that are needed to support sustainable and expanded scientific collaboration towards achieving health for all. Our session would end with a Q&A from the audience, and I would also like to highlight a few housekeeping rules. Please note that this event is being recorded, and please use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask your questions during the Q&A session. To get us started, we will listen to a keynote from Dr. Sumiya Swaminathan. Unfortunately, Dr. Sumiya Swaminathan, who is the chief scientist at the World Health Organization, has sent her regrets and would not be able to join us in person at this time. However, she recorded her keynote speech for this discussion, and I'm pleased to share with you this recording. Dr. Swaminathan's speech is entitled Progress, Gaps, and Needed Steps in Research and Development for Global Health at the SDG Midway Point.
Greetings from the World Health Organization. I'm Soumya Swaminathan, and it gives me great pleasure to share a few thoughts with you today, and I apologize for not being there in person. It sounds like a really interesting program. What I was asked to comment on was whether what gaps I see in R&D for global health, what lessons have been learned and should not be forgotten to leverage science and innovation to achieve health for all as we're taking stock at the midpoint of the SDGs, and also why should R&D for global health continue to be a priority investment for sustainable development now and in the future. Now I just went and had a look at the WHO Observatory for R&D, which collects data from the 11 major research funders around the world, and found that only 0.2% of research grants were awarded to low-income countries, and that less than 0.5% of health products that were being funded were for the neglected tropical diseases. Also, that there are 56 times more health researchers in high-income countries compared to low-income countries. Now, all of these are data we've heard before, but what is worrying is the fact that this is not changing. And in fact, when we look at the allocation of research funding during COVID, and again, this is data that's being collected by Glopidar and the UK CDR, and they have it up on a public website. over 95% of funding again went to high-income countries, very little flowed into low-income countries, and also that there was a lot of duplication of research, of clinical trials in particular, which did not actually deliver on, the key outcomes or the indicators. So when we look again at the grants for biomedical research, this is for the year 2018 across the 10 funders that report data to World Report, it amounted to $33 billion for that year. Most grants were awarded for research. About 17% went for training and 8% for core support. 2/3 of all grants were for non-communicable diseases, and in fact, a quarter of investments in that area was for research into malignancies, and approximately 0.6% of grants targeted a pathogen in the WHO R&D blueprint list. And hopefully this will change now that we're all talking about pandemic preparedness and response. Of course, one of the things is to invest in research into the pathogens of pandemic and epidemic potential. We're updating our list, our priority pathogens list. So is the NIH. But the idea really is not only to do the R&D for developing countermeasures, which is very important, but also to support research in the endemic countries for those diseases, so that on the epidemiological side, the health systems, the social sciences, all of those areas of research need to be supported when there isn't an outbreak or an epidemic going on, so that during the crisis, those capacities that have been built and the infrastructure that has been created can pivot to addressing the emergencies. We know that COVID has had a negative impact on funding for the neglected tropical diseases. R&D funding dropped by 4% in 2020, and clinical development funding for the neglected tropical diseases fell by about $125 million in 2020. Maybe a lot due to the difficulty in conducting clinical trials during the lockdowns and travel restrictions. While poverty-related diseases represent 14% of the global burden of disease, only 1.3% of global R&D expenditure goes to these diseases. Now, just yesterday, I was speaking at an event that was organized by the Ascens Partnership as part of the Science Summit also, where we talked about the importance of equitable partnerships in research and how every research funder really needs to look into their own granting history to see whether they have actually changed over a period of time, building more equitable research partnerships. And we identified several areas, right from priority setting to developing the research plan to managing data, managing intellectual property, ownership, the authorship, the credit, for the work. All of these elements really need to be looked into, and I think research funders have a very important role to play here in this arena. And I think that in the area of research as well, we need to pay close attention, and there are several metrics that have been developed, and frameworks and tools, but really we don't need any more of those. What we need is implementation and then measurement and accountability. Every research funder really needs to become accountable to building these equitable research partnerships, which in turn by themselves will end up addressing the priorities of the countries and the people within the countries, rather than cater to the priorities that have been set somewhere else globally. We know that for product R&D we have all types of different financing models, the push incentives, the pull incentives, the pooling mechanisms, the public-private partnerships. But again, we need to start thinking about equitable access and how can we ensure that especially research and R&D that's funded using taxpayer money, using public funds, results in access to the products that are being developed for populations that are vulnerable and underserved, whether they live in high-income countries or in low-income countries. We know that there is inequitable access to health products. And so research funders have an important role to play here, because of the contracts that are signed. And in fact, that is the exact opportune moment to build in the language in the contracts which will enable equitable access later on. And we've seen what happened during COVID. We've seen taxpayer money funding the basic R&D, which then leads to the development of either mRNA vaccines or drugs, but the IP then is completely in the hands of the private sector. And because there were no inbuilt provisions for access, there was nothing that the private sector needed to honor. So that's again something that really need to change. And I think everyone has a role to play. And if nothing else, COVID-19 has shown us that stewardship and good governance can do a lot. It reduces the risk for the private sector, and it uses the capacities of the private sector to produce products. But if stewardship and governance is not put in place and is not looking at the public health interest of populations, then these very often you may end up with products that are either not useful for public health or which are not then accessible anymore. As far as the WHO is concerned, we're doing our best through the work of the Science Division to address some of these issues in terms of coming up with policies and guidelines, but also working with the product development partnerships, the PDPs, as well as the research funders, to try to align on some of these priorities, and also to try and support the work of the PDPs through providing upstream advice on target product profiles, on preferred product characteristics, on the regulatory and policy pathways that would need to be followed. A good example is a TB vaccine, a new TB vaccine, and we've actually developed all of these, both the policy pathway and the regulatory pathway. But we also need to look at financing and procurement for these new products, and how will they actually be procured and distributed and deployed in countries of all income levels. So I think we've learned a lot over the last many years, including during the pandemic. And we have a responsibility, whether we are a research funder, a researcher, a policymaker, or a citizen, somebody who's impacted, can all play a role in promoting high quality collaborative research. We need to ensure that the principles of good clinical research practice are followed, that safety and efficacy are established. And most importantly, I think we need to, of course, invest in the long-term capacities of institutions and researchers and countries, and to ensure that all contributions are recognized fairly, that benefits are shared equitably, and that affordability, availability, and suitability are concerns which are considered right at the very beginning of the research. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to Dr. Swaminathan for that engaging keynote, which really sets the tone for our first panel discussion. And during the first panel, we would focus on successful collaborations from inclusive innovation and equitable access that are leading us towards the sustainable development goals and achieving those. And without further ado, I'd like to invite our first group of panelists, Dr. Pizarro, Dr. Njeka, Dr. Lacerda, and Ms. Maureen Morenga to join us. So I'll address my first question to Dr. Luis Pizarro, who is the Executive Director for Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. Dr. Pizarro, we know that DNDi has tremendous expertise and is committed to developing partnerships that translate R&D in developing medications for neglected tropical diseases from the very early ages by building strong partnerships towards getting these products to the populations that actually need them. Can you tell us a bit more about how DND builds access into innovation strategies from the inception phase? And can you also just give us some practical examples as to how DNDi has managed to deliver these products that they lead the development in.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buguma, for this question. And I'd like to thank first my colleagues from MMV and TB Alliance for this excellent and very exciting panel we have here. As you said, I would like to really respond to your question with a very practical example. And I think one of the main achievements we had at DNDi has been the human African trypanosomiasis called sleeping sickness, and how with colleagues in DRC we have been addressing this access question. And I would like maybe insist on two different elements. The first one will be more around the drugs development side, and the second one will be more around partnership and access. On the first one, the drug development side. First of all, and I think all of us are now very aware, every research for a new drug needs to start in a first discussion with patients, with doctors, nurses, with all the people who are in the first line concerned by the disease. We cannot think we're going to design a new treatment, in New York, in Geneva, or somewhere else. It is where the disease is really has strong burden that we need to start this discussion. I think it's very, very important we insist on this point. Second, it's also very important for us to have a sort of double strategy. It means that of course, we would like to develop a new chemical entity, a new drug that will fix all the issues we have in mind, but we know that it takes time. It takes sometimes 10 years or 12 years to go to the final process of research and development for a new drug. So parallel to this long-term approach, we think always on how we can repurpose a drug we know already that can be useful for this disease. And that was the case for trypanosomiasis. We started working with two treatments together called NECT. That was something we could really bring very fast to the field, because before that, the only treatment we had was very painful, killing 1 on 20 patients. All treatment, everybody wanted to move away from that. So we said, okay, we can maybe very quick find drugs that we can repurpose and bring a solution. And NECT was very successful, really curing the disease, but had some issues because the logistic was complex. It was intravenous drug. So we knew that we have something. It was better for the patient, but it was not enough. So parallel to this, as I said before, we engaged in a new chemical entity, in a new drug called flexinidazole. And after several years, we succeeded to have this drug now in the field, treating patients in 2 weeks with an oral drug, so very easy to treat. And this is an amazing success. But it was not 100% what we wanted, because it was 2 weeks and it needed also some logistics. So we said we need to go further. And we are now working in a third drug called acoziborole, who will be a one single dose, one time. And what is very important is not only the drug, but it's also that with a drug like this, you can have what we call test and treat. It means you can test the patient, give one drug, and we know with that, we're not so far from going to the elimination of sleeping sickness. So it's a very good example, I would say, on the research and development side. But that happened only if we have a good partnership. And this is my second point. We did not this alone. I mean, MSF was working on this in the field for a long time. Of course, the Ministry of Health and the Trypanosomiasis National Program was working on this too. We received a lot of support from the Gates Foundation that is still working with us on this, very engaged. And because this is a common good, it means that it's the public and the private sector working together. We engage with Sanofi in order to screen all their database to bring this drug and now to produce and make this drug available. So that would be my message here, is really to insist on how we need to work first with the patients, with the doctors who are concerned by that, go in parallel sites, repurposing drugs we know and developing new drugs and building strong partnerships. And that's going to be key for the future, because in diseases like, for instance, dengue, a very important one with the climate change problem we have now, we are in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America, doing the same sort of South-South collaboration with all the colleagues in the field to bring new drugs for this disease. So I will stop here maybe for the moment. I'm happy to come back in the Q&A if there are some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Pizarro. That's a really tremendous progress. And just to kind of help you round out and make us understand a little bit more of that journey, I wanted you just to comment on what you feel have been one of the major challenges in this process that you have described so well.
Maybe something, when I said it's about public-private partnerships, it means that we, of course, need to all engage on this, but we need to have the same understanding on what does it mean access, having a real, transparent, and respectful discussion on an access policy, because there are some questions about intellectual property, about strategies then, to procure, supply, and make these drugs available for patients. So it is a challenge, but it's a challenge we can really address well if we engage from the beginning a very clear chart, I would say, with all of our colleagues here engaged in this research and development project. And we're very clear, and this is for DNDi something very important, that access until the end will be the key driver for us in this partnership.
Thank you. And I think that segues nicely into our second panelist. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Norbert Njeka, who is Chief Director of TB Control and Management in South Africa's National Department of Health. And of course, when we think about TB, we know that those challenges in actually converting research and development to action that actually helps patients is one of those areas that is very key in tuberculosis. So Dr. Njeka, TB continues to be a deadly pandemic that affects millions globally, and at this time actually kills twice as many people each day as COVID-19. Could you please share with us your experience with how South Africa has continued to move research and development of new tools to fight tuberculosis?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, indeed, tuberculosis is a very old disease, very old pandemic that is now killing more than twice as many people as COVID globally. In South Africa, we do have approximately 205 cases of COVID a day and 900 cases of tuberculosis per day, which gives us 328,000 cases of TB per year. That's quite a lot. And we know from the 2020 report that approximately 167 people die from tuberculosis per day in South Africa. It's really a big problem. We know that COVID has caused a lot of havoc to our TB to fight towards ending tuberculosis. It looks like we're now recovering, but drug-resistant tuberculosis remains a major problem for us. We have one of the highest numbers country per country. We now have approximately 7,500 cases of drug-resistant TB per year in the country, although it has dropped. But treating these patients has been a nightmare. I remember some 10, 12 years ago, we would see almost half our cohort die before end of the report, before we could report. But at this stage, things have improved, but not to the level we want them. We treat patients with 23 tablets a day for 9 months. Some of them get 18 months of treatment. It is really a lot. 60% of our cohort are people living with HIV. So you'd imagine if you add the pill burden of HIV to the TB one, it is a big problem. We've been participating in various research projects to improve this, including the Bidaquilin Clinical Access Program and the BPAL. BPAL one is very exciting. You would know that a NIC study was essentially done in South Africa. It looked very, very good, but then went on to do Xenix and all this. The 6-month regimen is really something we want to scale up early next year, working very hard to introduce this by January next year, because we are hoping to then increase our treatment success rate to 85–90% and save a lot of money on drugs, save money on laboratory tests, and really very, very exciting, working hard with our expert committees in the country, where funds to buy Pretomanid and all the drugs that are required. And we are hoping that this will be really a game changer in TB control in South Africa and also globally. We hope that other programs will do the same. And we hope that the UN high-level meeting next year will really provide an opportunity for more advocacy for tuberculosis and also more resources for tuberculosis. Thank you.
I just would like you to comment, Dr. Njeka, on how you've navigated the competing attention that COVID had and had diverted a lot of the attention from the work that was being done on TB, how you kind of navigated the pandemic and continuing to keep the focus on tuberculosis, which has such a high burden in South Africa. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, it's been really difficult to keep focus on TB. At some point, we were all deployed to Covet. I myself became the lead facilitator for COVID training, but we continued to do messaging. We made sure within those COVID structures, we talk about tuberculosis, and I think it became possible to refocus on TB more when we got our numbers go down, but also our political commitment. Our minister is really behind the fight against TB, HIV, all our major health problems. So that really become helpful to navigate through this this difficult situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll turn to our next panelist, Dr. Lacerda, who is an infectious diseases physician at the Tropical Medicine Foundation, Dr. Haito Veria Durado, and a public health specialist at the Leonidas and Maria Dean Institute in Brazil. Dr. Lacerda, you have tremendous experience on malaria research in Brazil, and your work has actually led to a lot of breakthroughs on the treatment of vivax malaria in your country. Could you please tell us about these innovations and the promise that they hold for malaria in that part of the world?
Well, thanks very much for the question, and thanks from MV for letting me speak out here on their behalf. It's been a very long partnership over the decades. We have been focusing a lot on vivax malaria in Brazil, especially because it represents in this country around 85% of all the cases. It's not the big killing parasite as it is in Africa, but we have been showing over time the huge social impact of this disease in workers, in children, the substantial amount of hospitalization which are triggered by vivax infection. And because of that, we have been playing the role of showing that new drugs are possible to be used in such infection, such as the artemisinin combined therapies. We have also been testing better regimens of primaquine, which is a drug used traditionally since the 50s to lead to radical cure of this parasite, which interestingly leads to relapses every 2 or 3 months in the field. So that's really stressful for the population if they're not taking primaquine, which requests them to be using for at least 7 days, or most of the countries use for 14 days. And because of that, we have also been involved in the clinical stage development of the phenequine, which is a drug from the 70s, which could be used as a single dose drug for the radical cure. It's naturally a much better option for the neglected populations, such as the indigenous populations, which actually are those populations now with increasing numbers of malaria. And therefore, if you could simplify the regimen, that's definitely something that will change their lives. The problem is that both primaquine and tafenoquine, they need for the radical cure to be used in patients who are ideally G6PD normals. So G6PD, glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, is a deficiency that happens in Africa much more than here in Latin America. But for example, in the Brazilian Amazon, 5% of the population are deficient. And because of that, they cannot use either primaquine or tafenoquine. And for the first time during the development of tafenoquine, we had the chance to have one of the few experiences with pharmacogenetics in the ground, performing the test to detect this genetic deficiency before prescribing tafenoquine to the population. And the result of all this history, which is happening for a lot of time, we have been able recently to perform the first use of the tafenoquine used in the field in a real life situation. So it's really rewarding to see that after all the effort that we had, we are now taking this drug developed long time ago to the mouths of those who really need it.
That is really great to hear how much progress has happened. And I can imagine that it has required a lot of partners in terms of testing and treatment, and likely, significant contributions from different actors. Could you comment on some of these partnerships and contributions and how they really were important in crystallizing the work that you've been able to do? And also, now that you have this tool and you're trying to get to that last mile, what are some of the barriers that you think really exist in translating these tools that you have to actually helping the population and eliminating malaria as a problem in Brazil?
Well, I think that the fact that we are giving tafenoquine nowadays to the population that really matters is a huge effort of many institutions. More than a decade ago, GSK, together with Medicines for Malaria Venture, MMV, they've run together the clinical stages, the adequate clinical stages during the development of this drug, when we were very proud to be part of those stages. It's very important to say that PATH, together with private sectors such as SD in Korea, they were helping in the development of a point-of-care G6PD testing, which is absolutely necessary for this implementation. Since the very beginning, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have been very supportive, and specifically in Brazil, Global Health Strategies, GHS, has been playing a very important role in trying to put together all that is known outside Brazil with the public health actors in Brazil. And of course, there has been a very close and active observation of this whole process from World Health Organization and PAHO as well. The Ministry of Health in Brazil has been very supportive, and actually it was the one institution that decided to be the major partner during this implementation process, which started last year, 2021, and it's been more than a year of this whole implementation. Of course, all the 2 states which were the first states to implement the drug, together with researchers from Fiocruz, which is a very respected institution in Brazil, and also local institutions in Amazonas and Rondônia states. And that all happened despite the efforts of COVID-19 pandemics. So the whole process was delayed, but hopefully, even with the challenges of the pandemics, we were able to demonstrate that tafenoquine could be safely used in the field. As I said before, research was done in a real-life perspective, and the difference with this implementation was that the major actors in public health in Brazil, they leaded the whole process. So the investigators were just there supervising, giving advice, and analyzing the data. But those who are in the process of controlling malaria were the same people to implement the new drug and the new test for G6PD. About the last mile, it's always the most difficult part of getting rid of malaria. I think that without new tools, we will never reach anything better than control. Of course, tafenoquine or any drug should not be the silver bullet to get rid of this vampire, but we have to capitalize on the well-existing tools which are in place, but together with real innovation. Since the 60s, drugs for malaria are definitely one of the best innovative tools that will probably lead to the elimination of this disease in the near future.
Thank you so much. That's incredibly well said, Dr. Lacerda. And I think that, bringing back to the point of the last mile, we know from our previous speakers that although we've had research and development gives us the tools, we can't really achieve getting to that last mile without proper community engagement. And I think that really segues nicely into our next panelist. I'm delighted to introduce Ms. Maureen Morenga, who is the founder of Lean Me Foundation. Maureen, thank you so much for joining us, and it's a real pleasure to have you here today and hear your thoughts. I know you have been very open about living with HIV since the early 2000s, and you've also been very vocal about being treated for other infectious diseases, notably malaria, several times. Talking about that community engagement and the importance of community engagement in actually allowing us to use the research and development tools to help those who need it the most, we would really love to hear more about your story and what encouraged you to start the Lean on Me Foundation to provide care and support to girls and young women living with HIV and affected by TB in Kenya.
Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I think my story is such a long one, so I'll try to really shorten it. And I was diagnosed with HIV in the early 2000s, where we did not have like rapid diagnosis. So you'd get tested and come for your result after 2 weeks, 2 agonizing weeks. And when I first got my results, I didn't believe those were true results. So I did them 5 times before accepting that I was actually HIV positive. So you can imagine how much time I wasted. But even that, there was no care. You just be told you're positive and you're told how long you'll stay. I was given 6 months. I was expectant with my child, and because of that, he got HIV from me. So after some long wait, many lives lost, we got treatment, but it was only treatment for adults. There was no treatment for children. And for someone like me who had a child who also got the infection from me, it was difficult to take my drugs and look at him die. So I would break the adult formulation and give him half the dosage, not knowing what it would do to his body. I didn't even know if it had side effects. I just wanted him to be alive. And so it took a while before we got pediatric formulations. And then look at us now. There's pediatric formulations. We have point of care diagnosis. In fact, we have self-test for HIV, which you can do at the privacy of your house. We have shorter regimens for TB treatment. We have better mosquito nets for malaria. So I think research has made life better for people like us. And I was really amazed at COVID. I'm also a survivor of COVID. I had long COVID and I was on oxygen for 3 weeks. So I was really amazed at how quick things went. And with that kind of political goodwill, I think we can really change the narrative of research and bring commodities and tools to the life-saving tools to the people who need them on time, because time is a factor. Between the time we knew our status and the time treatment for HIV reached my community, many people had died. Many people I knew personally had really died. And so as we celebrate the gains that research has made, we also know that we haven't done very well on the TB response. We are still waiting for the point for the rapid diagnosis for TB. And about, was it 3 or 4 years, 4 years ago, my son had TB. He had gastrointestinal TB. He's in boarding school, so it was difficult to diagnose. By the time the school called me to tell me my son was unwell, and they were thinking it was ulcers, that my son had acute ulcers and I don't know, H. pylori, I could not recognize him. He looked like an old man. He had lost weight. He was very dark. He was, I could not recognize my own child, and he was dying. But because I know the signs and symptoms of TB, I started him on TB treatment before we got a diagnosis. I was just doing it like a mother to save a child in a situation where people cannot really diagnose what was wrong with him. But by the time they diagnosed that he had gastrointestinal TB, I had given him medicine for 2 weeks. And I think that was a life-changing initiative, which I shouldn't have done. But so that's why I'm saying with TB, we still have a long way to go. We still need, I would have lost my son in that process. And I always give people a story about the blue pill. There's a research that was done on the PrEP, the prevention medicine for HIV. And they went so fast, they developed the commodities, and now it was to be rolled out. So priority populations for rolling out were sex workers in Kenya. So we mobilized the sex workers, we prepared them for this wonder drug that would help them prevent HIV in case their clients refuse to use condoms. It was such a very beautiful discussion. And then came the research centers were set up and everything was done. So when they came to be enrolled, they realized it was a blue pill, and they went like, the color of the pill will not allow us to use it, because if we are found in the bars and where we do our work with blue pills, then we can even be murdered, because there are other sex workers who use blue pills to drug their clients and steal from them. So the color of the pill failed the study that had well been prepared for, so much invested in, and that is because there was no meaningful engagement. Nobody had engaged our community to the extent of discussing what the final commodity would look like and if it is acceptable and stuff like that. So they told us they'll wait for the white pill or any other color, yellow, blue, whatever, yellow, pink, whatever, but not blue. So that was really evident of why we should be engaged at an early stage in the design, in the development, the thinking through of the whole process. It's really important that we are engaged. And like I always say, I talk about women a lot. Women are always left behind. When they bring new, better commodities, they tell us, oh, we don't know what will happen if you're pregnant. We don't know if this is okay for women of reproductive age, or you Africans just get pregnant, you don't plan. So if you are under the reproductive age, we cannot give you this drug. And so they delay initiation for us to enjoy new commodities. We struggled when they brought efavirenz as a HIV commodity. We struggled when they brought dolutegravir. We really had to fight to get there, because one, we have not been involved in the study. Right now, people living with HIV are enjoying the U is equals to U. They're saying undetectable is equals to untransmittable, but they're saying they're not sure about breast milk. So it's just that we feel left out by some of these sciences. as women. And the same happens to pediatrics and children. Every time there's a commodity, they're not sure how it will work for children. But I'm sure with the right attitude and with the good buy-in from scientists and politicians and everyone else, we can have a modality, or we can have rules that allow us to bring the life-saving commodities to children and women in a timely way so that they are not left behind. I know there are restrictions of age and consent and all that comes with it, but I think we can work around this to ensure that we are saving lives collectively. So we are calling for a more inclusive process. We want research and literacy to empower women to engage more and ask questions around their bodies. If I'm a transgender and I'm on the hormonal therapy, how does the research or the commodities work for me, and not later, but immediately? So we also want that the researchers address the gender and human rights related issues and also support us to create demand. I know time is out, so allow me to stop here and answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maureen. And I think that, you've stated it so beautifully, highlighting the importance of researchers really listening to communities and addressing their needs in a manner that is inclusive and that also prioritizes groups that are often left out when we think about designing studies and interventions, because if we really want to reach these groups, we have to make sure that we're listening to what the community needs. And I think that that really sets the stage for the second panel. And I would like to thank our first group of panelists while inviting our second group of panelists to join us on the virtual stage. During the second panel, we will be focusing on enabling the environment to sustainably support research and the scale-up of innovations for sustainable development goals. Our first speaker, or the first person that I would like to bring into this discussion, is Dr. Radha Rangarajan, who is the director of the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, Central Drug Research Institute in India. The World Health Organization has many times reiterated that the center of gravity of research and innovation needs to shift to low and middle income countries for a well-functioning system of global health research. Dr. Rangarajan, what would you say is key for nationally led biomedical innovation that addresses unmet needs and results in affordable healthcare for all, given your vast experience in this area?
Thank you, Baguma, for the questions and thank you to DNDi for this opportunity to participate here. Innovation, biomedical innovation has traditionally been the domain of high-income countries because of the cost involved in developing products and taking them to market. But this has often meant that diseases that are relevant to low and middle income countries are neglected or put aside for a variety of reasons. It also means, for the commercial opportunity, clearly, but also it means that innovations that go to market in developed countries often take a long time to come to LMICs. And it is precisely for this reason that the organization that I represent, the Central Drug Research Institute, came into being. In fact, it goes back to 1951. So the organization was founded around a few years actually, right after independence of India, and it recognized that India will need to develop drugs that are relevant and important for the Indian population. So the model here at CDRI is to focus keenly on diseases which are of relevance to the Indian population, and then use very, very focused approaches, whether it's NCs or repurposed drugs or combinations, but to be very focused on specific clinical unmet needs. And then to work with highly defined TPPs, clear go, no-go criteria, and follow very, very, very structured processes to take drugs to market. Now, there have been essentially two models. One is that CDRI has gone all the way for example, its most well-known drug is a contraceptive, very safe. It's a once-weekly drug called centrochromin, and it was developed by CDRI in the 80s, and it went to market in 1991. The discovery and the development of the drug happened entirely at CDRI. It went all the way to market, and then found a commercial partner to take it to market. The other model is to seek partnerships early on, and this is a model that is quite popular globally. And the understanding here is that a partner will take on the clinical development part of the discovery chain, the development chain. Now, in principle, that model should work because the pharmaceutical company or the industry partner is receiving or is entering at a stage when there is already some data on the compound. But what has happened, especially at CDRI, is that we are now recognizing that India has a double burden. It is not just communicable diseases, but also non-communicable diseases. So metabolic diseases, cancers, they are also important to address from an affordability point of view and also from an unmet need point of view. And so the evolving model here is one of early partnerships and engaging with other public institutions, other donor agencies such as DNDi, TB Alliance, MMV, organizations like this that can help generate early clinical data. So essentially phase 1, phase 2A, which would allow the de-risking of the compound and for proof of concept of efficacy to be established and along with safety. And then those compounds, then once they have gone through early clinical development, then the model is to out-license those to partners. Now, here is another, twist. In the Indian landscape, when you look at pharmaceutical companies, they typically are generic manufacturers whose business model is to manufacture in bulk and to sell generic drugs globally. NCE development, new drug development, is typically not part of their business model. So what we've discovered is that it is difficult to find local partners, which means that, and together with our focus expanding to metabolic diseases, what we found is that a key aspect of becoming successful at what we do is to be able to find global partners, global pharmaceutical companies who will be willing to take the compounds through the rest of clinical development, understanding or hoping that we can reserve commercial rights to India, perhaps, so that we can still ensure affordability for the Indian population. So these are models in evolution. The first model, where CDRI has taken things all the way to market and then commercialized through a partner, that model has been very successful at ensuring affordability. The second model, where you enter into a partnership earlier on, this is still work in progress, but I believe that this is going to be key for us to scale our activities and for us to continue to meet India's and other LMIC's unmet needs.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad that you raised that second point where the challenge really is, because, India has done such a tremendous job in generic drug development, and a lot of the world actually relies on India as an R&D industry for these generic products. What do you think it would take to really move from just, the production of generic medications, but really going on to like the discovery of medications, particularly thinking about medications that are directed at poverty-related and neglected tropical diseases? How do you think we sort of thread that needle and incentivize R&D in India to really take this on because of the tremendous potential that it has for having a global impact?
Right. So I think that the Indian pharmaceutical industry is very clear about its priorities to its shareholders and to the world at large. We are good at manufacturing, bringing down cost and supplying to the world. But the hesitation to get into drug discovery and development is driven by by their business models, as well as by the very heavy investments, upfront investments that are needed. So I think that institutions like CDRI and other publicly funded institutions need to work within the constraints of this model, and it can be done. What it means is, like I said earlier, de-risking compounds so that they can be made, so that some of the risk of failure is addressed. But also, I think India can play a role in creating a network of institutions that can really support drug development through the different stages, and then take it to the pharmaceutical industry to really complete the last mile delivery and distribution. And I think that is just as critical as the other stages of drug development, which we've already talked about in the first panel. And so I think that we should understand and embrace the constraints of the generic manufacturers, focus on building a network of publicly funded or charitable organizations that are willing to play a relay race in the development of compounds. And then and together with that, or in parallel with this process, ensure that licensing agreements progress so that you're not left high and dry when development is completed, and there is a pathway to market. And finally, of course, all of the incentive mechanisms. I mean, even during COVID, Pfizer had to be incentivized to produce a COVID vaccine. So we're talking about much smaller pharmaceutical companies, generic manufacturers in India and other places. So incentivizing them through either a subscription model or some sort of a guarantee of purchase of drugs should they be approved and go to market. These are some of the ways in which I think we can bring pharma partners on board. But I think that a significant responsibility of taking these compounds through the early stages of clinical development, in fact, as far as possible, will lie with publicly funded institutions. I don't see a very easy way around that.
Thank you so much for your insight on that area. And I think that this is a great time to bring in someone from the funding end of things. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Cooney, who is the director of the Global Health Innovative Technology Fund, to join this conversation. We can't do a lot of the R&D that we need to do in poverty-related diseases and neglected tropical diseases without global funding. You are part of the international sort of donor space, and it seemed like since the pandemic we have had a steady stream of new outbreaks, re-emerging disease outbreaks, monkeypox, COVID, HIV not doing well, TB needing attention. And there's a real sense of anxiety that this may translate into a fatigue on the donor side of things. Given that Japan will be hosting G7 next year, can you provide your perspective on what needs to be done to continue to increase and sustain investments that are needed in the global health space, so that we can really achieve equitable and sustainable country-led innovation and access?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me in this very important meeting. Well, actually, maybe I can say three things. One is real advocacy. Second one is partnership. And third one is maybe capacity building or technical assistance. So first one, advocacy. COVID is a really kind of crisis and also challenges, but at the same time opportunities, because we could see real kind of a resource mobilization in a very short term, and also make that impossible possible, right? That vaccine was developed within 1 year, right? So it's a really kind of a epoch-making kind of event for all the infectious diseases. But as you said, currently there is a kind of pooled funding for, fifth, financial intermediary funding. Actually, Japan also joining and discussing that, how to use and what is a trigger, etc. And when I talked with a variety of PDP and donors, including Japanese government and the US and others, I found that quite a less interest in NTD, even tuberculosis and malaria. That is why we need collective advocacy, among us, and even inviting variety of other people, because it is not only, NTD, but even tuberculosis, malaria, and other kind of health issues as well. So we really need to have a very joint advocacy, especially toward that donor government and the other G20 and even the countries in Africa and Asia. Because G7, I'm a kind of advisory also to the G7 summit. So I'm also kind of chairing one a working group called the 100 Days Mission. So primarily, the mission of this 100 days is, make available that the new safe and effective vaccine, therapeutics, and that diagnostics within 100 days next time of a threat. But we really want to utilize these opportunities, not only for pandemic preparedness, but also NTD. So currently I'm thinking that the 100 days mission plus include, that access and delivery, not only just the R&D, but at the same time, not only just the pandemic preparedness, but tuberculosis, malaria, and NTD, etc. But anyway, first one is advocacy, really strong advocacy to government, and also Gates Foundation and others. Second one, the partnership. We also have to make most of the limited funding more effectively and efficiently. So maybe we can see that portfolio review, the global portfolio review, and try to prioritize our research and development. And maybe we can have a co-financing or portfolio financing, etc. Try to, make that R&D success rate much higher and expediting, that kind of speed. And third one could be a capacity building. As someone said, we also need to support the, countries, especially Africa, Asia, Latin America, to have a, better capacity in laboratory, and at the same time, research and development. Recently, I visited Senegal, and I found that at the Institute Pascal, that Dakar, it is not only, Pasteur Institute, but supported by a variety of, the donors. And they set up that quite good, not only R&D, the institution, but at the same time, training and capacity building. So we also need to build the capacity of human resources and facilities and technologies to, the exceeding and also the expediting that R&D on the ground. Maybe better to stop here.
Thank you. Those are some very excellent points. But before I let you go and move on to the second speaker, I want to come back to the advocacy piece, which is what you started out with. And I think that from the perspective of advocates, there's a certain sense of frustration in that they seem to be doing a lot and talking about all the threats that we're faced with. And we have just witnessed the global pandemic that led to trillions of dollars lost economically for the world. We are faced with monkeypox, which was for a long time a neglected disease and now is causing an emerging global pandemic. And we now have the problem of Ebola again affecting a country like Uganda. What are advocates doing wrong, and why is the message not getting across? Because there seems to be a missing link between advocates speaking out on these issues actually translating into governments and policymakers taking this on and giving more funding for us to address this problem. So what would be your advice to advocates in terms of changing the strategy in how we engage with funders and policymakers?
Yeah, maybe a better first one is avoid the fragmentation. Maybe better to have a kind of joint advocacy, not only NTD, but the tuberculosis, malaria, and even HIV and even pandemic preparedness. And currently, the lot of discussion are very much fragmented, but actually these are infectious diseases. And we could, that repurpose variety of technologies, even technologies used for that COVID. We could, utilize those for NTD, right? And we also could have even access and delivery. We could have an integrated way of access and delivery. We shouldn't have just only, supply a chain for TB or malaria, but better to have, NTD, TB, malaria, and even, the COVID, etc. So we really need to have a bit kind of a more integrated way or cross-cutting way of thinking for advocacy even. And other one is important one is the the resource mobilization is not only from the rich countries, but domestic, resources is very, very critical. And NTD is not so expensive in terms of, purchasing the medicines, right? So we need to provide a good investment case, and we should show how much that each country need to, procure the NTD medicines, and we should put those in a budget of a bigger, the budget, not just only at NTD, but even including that the pandemic preparedness and other infectious diseases, etc.
Thank you so much for that. And I'll bring in now Anna Dubel, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Polysecure's Research, and to join the conversation, specifically wanting Anna to focus on the area of how we actually get funders to be interested in funding and R&D for neglected diseases and diseases of poverty. Given that there is no market incentive to develop medical countermeasures for diseases that affect the poor, these require end-to-end partnerships and sustainable investments and financing. Anna, could you tell us more about the funding trends since 2015 for R&D for neglected diseases affecting the world's poorest populations, just to give us an overview of where things stand? And if anything gets measured in terms of what is done with the funding that actually is available for these diseases, and how do we ensure that they are sufficiently and optimally funded in order for us to be able to achieve our end goal of delivering health for all?
Sure, Boom. Thank you very much for having me. So at Polysecure's Research, we run the G-Finder project, which measures how much is invested each year in R&D for global health. If you're interested in our methodology, accessing our data and reading our reports, you can get that all online. Giving you an overview of the trends since 2015 is much like reliving each annual report writing season at PCR, which is a particularly stressful time for me. But one thing that I remember from my early days with the organisation was from 2015 is that for three straight years, we were able to celebrate record high funding for neglected diseases. And it was great news, although it did make it quite difficult to come up with original titles for our annual reports. But the global total increased from 3.3 billion in 2015 to 4.2 billion in 2018. So that was really promising growth. Since then, since 2018, funding has dropped back a bit. So just a little bit each year, sort of 3 or 4%, but it's brought us pretty close to the $4 billion mark. And I want you to keep that number in your mind, that $4 billion at the end of financial year 2020. So the interesting movements within that period. So you've got the US and in particular the NIH, and they're the giant here. So they've got $1.6 billion of funding each year that they provide. While it's difficult to clearly link funding changes to policy, any change in NIH funding is going to have a huge impact on the global total. The UK government, FCDO in particular, really stepped up its funding between 2017 and 2020, particularly to the PDPs. We're going to come back to that story. European Commission increased their funding, particularly to EDCTP, the European Developing Countries Trial Partnership. Indian government has really shown strong growth since 2014. Industry bolstered the global total in 2018, but after a couple of years, albeit those are years that have been affected by the pandemic, 2018 is now starting to look a little bit like an anomaly, but we'll see what happens in the next year. And just a quick word on diversity. There's far too few funders, with just 2 funders, the NIH and the Gates Foundation, accounting for almost 60% of global funding for neglected disease R&D. And that sadly hasn't really changed over the period. So we're currently reviewing the data for financial year 21, with a report being launched at the beginning of next year. And I just want to bring your attention to a couple of the areas that that are on our radar. It's possible that in FY 2020, that's last year's report, it was too early to see the effects of the economic consequences of COVID on funding. So perhaps funders were in agreements that lasted a few years, so they're a bit sticky and a bit slow to get out of that. So we might see the full impact of fiscal tightening in this year's report. As an example, the UK government announced large cuts to their aid budget sort of a couple of years ago, and we know anecdotally, but not from the G-Finder data, that affected a lot of PDPs. And indeed, I think that we're going to I think that the data is going to show probably around a 50% drop in FCDO's funding of neglected disease R&D in FY21. We think that clinical trials, were disrupted in 20 and 21. So the money spent on those later stage product development clinical trials may have taken a hit. And the third area of interest is whether there's going to be any springboarding off of the COVID research, as mentioned before. So we've seen investment in platform technologies grow strongly, and that seems to have become even more the case since the beginning of COVID. So we remember the $4 billion that we spoke about. That's the funding for all of the neglected diseases in the scope of G-Finder. HIV at like $1.5 billion, TB and malaria around 600. Some of the NTDs get 20 million a year, and as a group, they haven't grown in funding much over the past decade. Despite the record high in 2018, we still knew that $4 billion wasn't enough for all of those diseases. And we're talking about 30 odd diseases. We still don't have the products that we need. But there's still the question of how much do we need? And we all wish that COVID hadn't come into our lives, but it has given us a really interesting case study of what happens when you invest a lot of money into R&D. According to our survey, COVID R&D also received around $4 billion in 2020, the same amount as all of the neglected diseases put together. And the returns, as we know, the impact was incredible, with an astonishing pace to get new treatments, diagnostics, and vaccines. So what does that tell you? If you invest enough, we can get new medical countermeasures, and we can get them quickly. And in some ways, I think that the last few years should make us excited about what might be possible, because we've shown that through COVID. And also, if we want more funding, and this is coming back to the point before, there needs to be a compelling story. And I think that COVID provided that to governments and to industry and to philanthropic organisations, and they were very quick to open their wallets. But we still may need more and better evidence to show that investment in neglected disease R&D provides a good return on investment. And that brings me to your second question about measuring the impact of investment in R&D. And let me tell you, it's really difficult. So R&D takes place over a long time. It involves a lot of parties, a lot of failures. So trying to figure out what was invested in a particular product is tough. And then what impact are you actually measuring? Are you looking at the number of registered products or the number of clinical trials, DALYs, economic benefit, knowledge transfer? But at Polisecures Research, we're an ambitious lot, and recognising these challenges, we still think it's really valuable to try to come to some sort of consensus for how we should approach measuring impact. And so we've just started this project in the past few months. We've got an inspiring group of international experts, and with our partners, we're working towards developing a framework of measurement of impact across different domains. That's product development, skills, knowledge and network, supply and access, and lastly, health and economic impact. We're going to look at doing an analysis of the impact of 20 years of investment in R&D. And we're going to look to create material that advocates and parliamentarians and civil society and industry can use to argue for more funds and prioritise their investment, with good evidence. So I don't have the answer for you quite yet, but we're working on it.
Thank you so much. And I would say that we would be staying tuned to see some of the work that you're doing in reporting on measuring the impact of these investments, because that is so key for that advocacy that Dr. Cooney mentioned, to be able to show the funders that this is what investing in R&D can actually translate to. And I think, with that, I would bring in our last panelist for this second panel, which has been incredibly engaging. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Spiegelman, who is the Chief Executive Officer of TB Alliance. A lot of the conversations that we've had up until this point has really been focused on, those challenges from actually translating R&D all the way into solving problems and having tangible results. We know that TB is the world's oldest disease and really a pandemic that existed before other pandemics that we're dealing with today. We have seen the advancements in the last several years with new treatments for drug-resistant TB, but we are still really struggling with moving TB out of that pandemic phase as a neglected disease and a disease of poverty. What do you think is needed globally to finally bring an end to TB? I feel like this question is the one that if we crack the code on this, then we have basically figured out how to end neglected diseases. Dr. Spiegelman, could you please comment on this? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question, and certainly for the great jobs that all the panelists and you are doing today. Not meaning to be pessimistic, but unfortunately, I think pandemics due to poverty-related neglected diseases, and TB is perhaps a quintessential example, will not end in any reasonable period of time until we have truly radical changes in the financial and other incentive systems that are now in place really on a global basis. The present financial and economic structures will not adequately support work on TB or other poverty-related neglected diseases in the way they have worked for COVID, or for that matter, the non-communicable diseases that are prevalent also in high-income countries. So we need radical change in how we provide support to get us to the goal line. But in the meantime, however, and even if adequate resources were made available, we also need to focus on making significant changes in both how research and development for these diseases is done, as well as how access provisions are both conceptualized and then provided. So the short answer to your question is we need a radical change in the dynamics that provide for both funding of R&D as well as access to innovation for poverty-related neglected diseases. And simultaneously, we need significant changes in how we do R&D as well as how we provide for equitable access. Let me now just take a couple of minutes, though, to briefly share with you all and the audience two very specific examples in the field of TB where we are utilizing, I believe, fairly unique novel approaches both for R&D and for access. Norbert has done an excellent job in describing the problems of TB and also the importance of the BPAL regimen, which we developed over the past number of years. But to be understood in terms of the progress already even made and the future progress that will be made based on this regimen, the history is that once we saw the preliminary data on the potential utility of this extremely promising regimen for drug-resistant TB, we immediately employed a novel strategy to ensure high-quality, multiple generic manufacturers for the drug pritomanid would compete in the marketplace so the product would be both affordable and the supply sustainable. This process started in full earnest, although we conceptualized it much earlier, during the phase 3 program, not after the drug had received regulatory approval. And because of the incentives that were provided in this strategy, the initial price of pritomanid was a fraction of the cost of the other drugs that had been approved over the past 10 years or so for drug-resistant TB. And I can guarantee you, as the volume of product is increasing, we are confident that the price is going to come down even further. Now, I was going to say we can go into the details of all of this in the Q&A. I'm worried we're not going to have enough time individually, and I'd be happy to go into more detail. In the R&D arena, we're spearheading, as another example, the development of an experimental drug known as sutazolid. We've instituted what I believe is a totally unique approach to the global availability of an unapproved compound to all researchers who now are incentivized to raise resources to invest in the development of sutazolid. The major commitment that researchers make is that all the data that they generate goes into a common pool of data, which is then made available for regulatory purposes to all, and for just knowledge purposes, to all the researchers who have contributed to the pool of data and to all future researchers who wish to join this consortium by doing further studies. So again, we hopefully will go into this into more detail, but please contact me because this is a program of really a community of researchers and drug developers working on a common mission to bring the maximum amount of resources possible to developing a specific drug and doing it as quickly as possible. Thus far, both of these endeavors, I think, have been highly successful. So in summary, to NTB, we need a huge increase in sustainable funding coupled with significant innovation in how we best utilize that funding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spiegelman. So radical change in the way in which we're doing things is really how we can hope to tackle some of these diseases of poverty and neglected tropical diseases. We have just a few more minutes in which we'll try to take a couple of questions from the audience before we close this session. And I'd like to invite all of our panelists to please join the conversation again, and please turn on your video, and so we can take one or two questions from the audience before we bring the session to a close. While we wait for questions, I think I would start by maybe turning this, like going back to what Dr. Spiegelman closed out with in terms of the need for radically rethinking the way in which we are approaching the issue of neglected diseases and diseases of poverty in terms of translating research and development into concrete action. You gave very good examples of what you've done with TB. How do you think that, I sometimes get the feeling that actors who work on different diseases don't always talk to each other. How do we translate what's working for one disease in terms of that radical rethinking of how things are done into the other 30 diseases that need the same or similar attention? And start with you, Dr. Spiegelman.
So first of all, I think, and it's not just because of the co-sponsorship of this session, but I think, for example, the PDPs And specifically, I'd call out MMV and DNDi because we're all in the drug space together, but for obviously different diseases, have done a fantastic job in sharing information. We meet regularly, we go over what we have done, and without necessarily going to all the examples, but partially that's because we're incentivized to collaborate, as opposed to be very frank, the private sector who compete with each other because that's the underlying dynamics of the relationship there. We, because of how we have been set up, are incentivized to help each other. And it helps that we're all, I think, very compatible and, want to all, provide for the common good. But I think we have to look at whatever systems we put in place. What are the underlying incentives that are built into those systems to ensure that they are in the right direction for what we want to do? I think we have, it's my opinion at least, for example, that to ensure global health, we do not have to have a pot of gold of money at the end of that rainbow to get investment, which underlies the private sector, frankly, rationale for why we have to have high prices for drugs, for example. I think that's a false premise as one example, and we can get other radical ways to incentivize different groups to provide the work that has to be done to bring new products, new diagnostics, new vaccines, et cetera, to the people who need them.
Thank you. There's a question that has just come in, and I would like for Dr. Cooney maybe to comment on this. And the question is from Robin Waite, and it's, how is the PDP nonprofit model different to the private sector in terms of how organizations can and should engage with communities and issues of product access and delivery?
Well, yeah, interesting question, and also a bit kind of a challenging question. But yeah, actually, private sectors, I'm now working with the private sectors, and they feel, this is not investment, but it is kind of a donation, they call, because there's no kind of a market incentive and also a no profit. That is why maybe we also need to think about some sustainable procurement and access delivery, because usually WHO requests that pharmaceutical companies to donate those medicines after the development. That is why these incentivize variety of the pharmaceutical companies. That is why we also need to think about sustainable kind of financing, not only just getting the money from industrial countries, but at the same time, that the countries on the ground and also developing countries as well to provide some part of money. And so that kind of a financing mechanism is very, very critical. And also there are a lot of kind of a fragmentation in terms of this access and delivery, even procurement and distribution, very, very kind of a vertical. That is why maybe we need to have a very much more kind of integrated system of access and delivery. And the PDP, of course, we really need to work together. And as Mel mentioned, we already have a kind of a information sharing, especially GHIT. My organization is supporting an R&D of 22 the diseases, including TB, malaria, and a variety of neglected diseases. And I found a lot of kind of a synergy when we have variety of experts for selection committees and etc., because we could share some of the good practices or lessons learned. So that kind of a joint planning and the working is very, very critical. And I also want to add, there are a variety of the technologies, and especially AI-based screening. For example, we have done more than 1 million of screening, but we could expedite that kind of screening or discovery by using kind of AI and a variety of other technologies. Even messenger RNA, we apply this for malaria, and there are several antibody and other new technologies also could be applied for neglected tropical diseases. So I feel there are a lot of good opportunities.
We just have time for one more question, and I really want to get this in, and I want to bring in Dr. Pizarro to comment on this one, which is how do we apply what we learned from the COVID pandemic in terms of breaking records and responding to patients' needs to neglected diseases that are at their core neglected? The only reason that COVID-19 received so much attention was because of its global status, affecting not only impoverished communities, but first world developing countries. And we have a recent example with monkeypox as well. So how do we get attention when these diseases are affecting the poor? If you can just give us a 1-minute answer on that, Dr. Pizarro, and then we will close the session because we're running out of time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. 1 minute. Wow. So very quick. First, I think we understood that we need to work within, I would say, the crisis. So how we put in place platforms to have immediate research, clinical trials going on when a crisis is coming. It's one lesson learned. We did that with Anticov in Africa for Covet, and we have with a lot of partners in Africa and now India, Brazil, also launching a platform called Panther, to anticipate when those crises are coming. This is very clinical side. In a more political one, I would say we need to have a much better regulatory system in order, to have approval for new drugs coming very quickly in countries, and we need to strengthen local capacities, regulatory, but also manufacturing those products in the field. And maybe the last one, it's more around governance, and we talked about common goods, is how we understand that we are all connected in this world. So something that is happening today in DRC is something that concerns the whole planet, and we need to improve for sure the governance at this global level.
Thank you so much. I know I gave you a really challenging task to answer a very difficult question in a minute. With that, I really like to thank our panelists, and there's so many questions, but we had such limited time and I couldn't bring everyone back into the conversation. I would like to introduce Dr. Andrea Lucard, who is the Executive Vice President for Medicines for Malaria Venture, to provide us with some summary and closing remarks before we bring this session to a close. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's a wonderful thing to be asked to do after Dr. Luis just talked about how we're all connected globally, and how Mel just spoke about how we have to make a full change in all of our systems to make it work. So to sum that up, let's get to work. With this group of really esteemed panelists, Mel, I know you feel a little bit discouraged, but I have to say, looking at Japan, Australia, South Africa, Brazil, India, we are Kenya, I think, I'm sorry. We really do have a lot of problems to solve, and yet we're coming at it with so many different and interesting lenses. In particular, I just want to make a comment on Madame Maureen's really quite profound statements around what does it mean to be connected to the patients? What does it mean to be connected to the people who are right at the center of what is going to be done? And how much as PDPs, we really have been trying to do that, and yet we can do so much more and must. And at the same time, when we can see leadership as coming from the examples given in Brazil and India, on places where new models, people are thinking about new models. How do we think about new models of funding, of bringing in research institutions? This work is happening, and we need to keep the faith, and we need to keep it happening. COVID has brought us a lot of new and interesting tools in thinking about advocacy. It's shown some very unpleasant spotlights on how we don't manage to get access within our activities, and how we can and we must. And we can continue to think about that as PDPs and as part of the global research community. I would very much like to thank Dr. Buguma for a really well facilitated and interesting panel. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. And thank you so much for all of the panelists and all the people who spent time here today. We need to keep the work going, and we need to make the radical change, and we need to think about the patient at the beginning, at the end, and at the middle while we're all talking together. Thank you.
Thank you for those closing remarks, Andrea. And again, thank you to all the panelists for your insights and your thoughts on these very important issues. It was my pleasure to serve as your moderator today. And with that, I would give you back your time. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.